And good morning, everybody. Today we're starting our series on generous. And I want to just give you just a heads up. One of the reasons we're doing a series called Generous is because we want to inspire and encourage you to be generous, because you heard the announcement last week that our Logan campus, out of the blue, God is blessing us with this incredible opportunity to get into a new building. If you haven't heard what's happening all of our campuses are doing great and growing. Our Logan campus is in crisis because they've outgrown their building. They have people parking like 3 or 4 blocks away to get to church. It's awesome what God's doing in Logan. It's so cool. And we need a new building. We need, I think we have like 15 parking spaces at our Logan campus, which is nuts. And people keep coming, like they can't stay away. It's so cool what's happening. So we've been praying for this. Anyway, last week we mentioned that God dropped an opportunity onto our laps. So here's how we do this at Alpine Church. Because we're one church in many different locations. So six locations, 8 campuses in total when you include our 2 Spanish-speaking campuses. And so what we do whenever one of our campuses has a need, and this is very biblical, by the way, is we let the whole church get involved. We let everyone get involved, not just that campus. We let all the other campuses get involved. And so West Haven was a recipient of that several years ago when we opened up this campus. All the other campuses helped, donated, and we did all kinds of renovations and opened this campus. Layton was a recipient of this. Layton's our second campus. So when we opened our Layton campus, Riverdale, which was the original campus, Riverdale really sacrificially gave to make Layton happen. So this is just what we do. This is what I love about Alpine. Some churches can get kind of stagnant, and it's like this is just who we are. Alpine is growing. We're reaching more people. This is how we function as a church. And so we will have an opportunity, all of us, Riverdale, West Haven, Layton, Syracuse, all of our campuses will have an opportunity to contribute toward getting into this building in Logan. And so we thought this is a great opportunity for us to do a series on generosity. However, we're not just talking about financial generosity. We're not going to talk for 4 weeks about financial generosity. We're going to talk about that 1 week. And the other times we're going to talk about being generous in other ways. So we're going to talk about generous serving, being a servant with generosity. And we're going to talk about generous forgiveness. Because another way to be generous is with your forgiveness and by extending grace to people. And we're going to talk about all of this. This morning, I just want to get us started. We're going to just give an introduction. I want to define what generous means to us. We're going to have a working definition for this series. We're going to get into all that today. But before we do, can I just share a few statistics on generosity? Here's my theory. My theory is that Christians should be the most generous people in the world. Christians should be the most generous people in the world. And I think some statistics kind of bear that out. I did some research today. I don't want to lose you guys, but let me just share some statistics on generosity around the world. So research from organizations like the Barna Group found that Christians are twice as generous as non-Christians. That religious people are twice as generous as non-religious people. So again, that's kind of proving my theory that Christians are very generous. So for example, in 2018, secular households, non-Christian households, donated on average $1,225. $1,225 on average a year in 2018. And compared to religious households that year, 2,656. So more than twice, Christians were more than twice as generous as non-Christians, which kind of makes sense if you ask me. I've been a Christian my whole life. And so it's hard for me to put myself in the shoes of someone who didn't grow up in church, but growing up in church, and some of you are like this, growing up in church, these are where we learn values. These are where we come together and we get to hear messages about generosity and about how to live our lives and all these kinds of things. And so sometimes I put myself in the shoes of someone who never grew up with any of that stuff. Like Sunday mornings, they just watch sports. And I still watch sports on Sundays, by the way, but just not in the morning. I have to watch it in the afternoon. But there's nothing wrong with watching sports. But could you imagine, some of you, maybe this is where you were, could you imagine just living your life where you just did whatever you wanted to do all the time? And nobody ever talked to you, nobody ever challenged you to think differently. Nobody ever challenged you to live differently in your life. Like, I don't even know what that would be like if I didn't have this weekly check-in to get into God's word and get surround with God's people and serve in kids' church or on the worship team. Or, I mean, all of our campuses run on servants, on volunteers. It's amazing to see the volunteerism, but there are people who just live their lives for themselves all day, every day. That's not how Christians should be. Christians, we should be in a community where we learn how to be generous in all these ways. Generous with our giving, we'll get into that. Generous with our serving, generous with our relationships, with our grace, extending grace to one another. And so Christians should be the most generous. In fact, if you zoom out into countries, okay, so there's this thing called the World Giving Index where they rank countries based on criteria around generosity. The three criteria are helping a stranger, donating money, and volunteering time. Okay, so this is super interesting. This is the kind of stuff we're talking about. And so the question is, where does America rank? You ready for this? Let's go. Get ready. Everybody sitting down. Get ready. Leighton, are you ready? Okay, here it is. I'm gonna do a top 3 countdown. Number 3, Kenya. Kenya. Their overall score was a 60. And if you look into this, you say, well, why would Kenya be on the list? Well, Kenya has a Christian population of about 85%. 85%. So it doesn't surprise me that Kenya would be on this list in spite of the fact that they've got poverty and droughts and they've had to face all kinds of stuff. So Kenya's number 3 on the list. Number 2 on the list. You ready for this? This blew me away. Ukraine is number 2. What? Their overall score was 62. And these statistics are from 2023. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, and Ukraine is number 2 on the list, which if you think about it, that's actually not surprising because I think crises can really test your mettle and test what you're really about. As a nation or as a community or as a family, like when you're in crisis, that's when you know what you're really about. I remember in our neighborhood, we live in this neighborhood along a river, and years ago, remember when the river flooded and we had all that snow melt? It was crazy. In our neighborhood, there were several homes in our neighborhood that started getting flooded, and it was so cool to see our neighborhood jump into action. It was probably the most memorable week in our neighborhood. We got to know our neighbors. We got to serve alongside everybody's sandbagging together. Everybody's helping dig people out of their, get water, pump water out of their basements. It was so cool. Pulling carpet out and I mean, just everybody jumped in. It's because I'm blessed to live in a generous neighborhood, not just financially, but just that they're generous with their time. And I think that's what's going on in Ukraine. All right, you ready for number 1? This is going to blow you away. It's not the United States of America. It's Indonesia. And you're like, why would Indonesia be number 1? Their overall score was a 68. 82% of their people in the poll donated money, 61% volunteered time. The reason is because Indonesia has the largest Muslim population in the world. And generosity, the word is actually zakat, it's a form of charitable giving, is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. And so it's not surprising then that Indonesia would be so generous, even though Indonesia is not a wealthy country. United States made the top 5. All right, so there we go. We made the top 5. United States, their overall score was 10 points lower than Indonesia's, the number 1 score, but we still made top 5. 61% of Americans donate money, 38% volunteer time, and that puts us number 5 on the list. Now, by the way, for those of you, in case you watch a lot of news online, there's no country comes close to the United States in terms of total amount of money given to other countries in foreign aid. I want you to know. This ranking was something else. It was about individuals polled. Nobody comes close. However, we're not the highest. We're not even above average in terms of our countries giving to other countries, foreign aid that's called. If you consider our foreign aid compared to our GDP, we're actually below average. Which is interesting. If you know the Bible, we're going to talk about this next week, but you know the story about the widow who gave 2 coins and that was all she had. And then somebody else came, these rich people came in and they gave way more money than she gave, but Jesus praised the widow instead of the rich guys. We're the rich guys in that story. Now, I mean, I don't want to be political here, but I've always felt really proud to be an American and to know the impact that we make worldwide. And I do think that we're very generous. And certainly individuals are generous, by the way. Individual Americans are very generous. But our government isn't as generous as I thought if you measure it in those terms. And we're just so blessed to live in America. The reason our percentage is so low is because our GDP is so high compared to everybody else. We're just so blessed to live in America. So I think it's good for us to think about this and now to apply this. Let's stop talking about this on a national scale or even a global scale. Let's talk about this personally on a personal scale. Let's challenge ourselves to be generous people. So before we get into how God is generous, I want to just start with our working definition. Here's our definition. Ready? Here it is. We're going to use this all month long for our definition of generosity. Generosity is giving to others through a selfless act without expecting anything in return. I want to break that down. There's 3 little segments to that definition that we're using. So number 1, giving to others. Obviously, as I already mentioned, we're not just talking about financial giving. That's part of it. So generosity has a lot of different dimensions. We're just going to look at 3 dimensions. We're going to look at the dimension of giving financially. Next week, we'll look at the dimension of serving and giving your time and your talents and your effort. We'll look at that in week 3 of the series. And then we're going to look at relational generosity, which I think is huge. Relational generosity is how gracious are you? How forgiving are you as a people? Because Christians should be the most gracious and forgiving people around. I don't know if we are. I don't know if the outside world sees us that way, but we should be. So we're going to talk about that at the end of the series. All right, so giving to others. The second part of this definition is a selfless act. Now think about, so generosity is a selfless act. So the truth of the matter is that most people are by default, the way that we're wired is we're generous toward ourselves. We're generous toward ourselves. So that's not generosity according to our working definition. Our default wiring is to be generous toward ourselves. Parents, you know this with your kids. I remember when our kids were little, we were always trying to teach them like the value of money and how to save and all these kinds of things. And our kids, for years, they would say, I'd go to Target with AJ and he'd be like, can we go down the Matchbox aisle? Because he just loved Matchbox cars and he always wanted every time we went, he always wanted a Matchbox car. And I probably broke him, I ruined him because I would buy him Matchbox cars whenever we would go hang out. And so then he was like accustomed to it. He was like, he felt entitled to it. But as he got a little bit older, I was like, I got to teach this guy the value of money. And so one time we went and he said, can I get a Matchbox car? And I said, no, you can't. And he threw a fit. It was terrible. It was just like his mom. He threw a fit. That's totally a joke. That was out of bounds. I shouldn't have even said that. But he threw a total fit and so awkward when she's right here. But I'm like, he's got to learn this. He's got to learn this. And so then the next time I did it again. And so I'm training this guy, like not to be so selfish. And then finally one day we went and he came with me to Target and he said, could I get a Matchbox car? And I said, yeah, sure. And he knew something was up. He's like, that was too easy. And so he kind of pressed in a little bit and I said, you can get it, but you have to use your own money for it. And now he had a decision to make because he had learned the value of money and we'd given him an allowance and things like he had his own money and he felt like he had worked really hard for his money. He didn't learn till later that he didn't. We're all just blessed. God just blesses us, guys. God, but not just the young kids. We're blessed. If you're in America, you won the lottery. So we're just so blessed. And sometimes we feel like we've earned it. I'm not saying that we don't work hard, but like God has blessed us to live in this country and have what we have. He just has. And I'm trying to teach AJ this value. So can I have a Matchbox car? Sure you can. Are you going to buy it? No, you got to buy it. If you want it, you can but you could buy it yourself. And now he had a decision to make. It was so funny. We started doing that with him then in his life as we were just being a lot more generous toward him, but saying you got to use your own money for it. And then it was a whole different decision. It's different, man, when you got to use your own money. We're going to talk about this next week when we talk about generosity, because I think the key to being generous then is to understand it's not your money, that we're actually stewarding God's money. And when you view your money like that, it's crazy how it unlocks generosity in our lives when we recognize it's actually God's money. Anyway, that's for next week. But generosity, biblical generosity by definition, is a selfless act. It's that you're actually thinking about someone else and you're breaking that wiring of thinking about yourself. I tell this story all the time. You've probably all heard it, but years ago when the kids were still little, we were at a church picnic, and I remember I was sitting down there and I started eating my food, and I look up and I see Tracy in the line with 2 plates, one for each of our kids. And I was sitting there selfishly eating my burger already. And before you judge me, at least all the dads in here admit it. You're probably just like that too. Like, I think moms tend to be wired a little bit less selfishly than dads, but that was a big lesson for me early on. I ate before I went to the picnics. Just kidding. No, it was a lesson. It was a lesson for me to be more like my wife and to be more of a servant and to be more selfless. So we're going to be learning in this series about what that really means. Or think about selflessness when it comes to relationships. We'll get into this in the 4th week of the series, like selflessness when it comes to forgiveness. There's this thing called a fundamental attribution error. Google it. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but we've all done this before. Let me try to explain this. When somebody else does something like loses their control, when somebody else just like loses their head in a situation, what's going on in your mind is they're a bad person. That's who they are. That's what they do. That defines them. They're selfish or they're a hothead or whatever when somebody else loses their cool. When you lose your cool, usually you say something like, I'm just having a bad day. So fundamentally, you attribute the best things to yourself and your personality and your character, but you don't cut the other person the slack that you tend to cut yourself. That's called the fundamental attribution error. In other words, by nature, we all tend to be generous to ourselves and not to others. We're going to talk about this in week number 4, that as followers of Jesus, we should be generous toward other people. Like, we should give grace to other people, even more grace than we give to ourselves. We'll talk about that in week 4. And then the last part of this definition is without expecting anything in return. Now, this is a hard one. I think these other 2 parts of the definition are easier to wrap your mind around. This one's hard to wrap your mind around because it's hard to be honest with yourself. I mean, be honest, husbands. Have you ever done anything for your wife where you didn't expect something in return? I know you're like, no, all the time. Just come on. Wives, I'm not going to let you off the hook either. Have you ever done anything for your husband where you didn't expect something in return? Maybe not right away, but at some point. At some point. Or how about even, you think about, I think it's easy to apply this to kids. Kids are so selfish. They don't even think about it in terms of, like, have you ever met a 3-year-old that did something for someone else without expecting something in return? Like, that is very unusual. I've met a couple kids like that are just off the charts different. But generally speaking, we see the sin nature in all of us, right? But what about the other way around? Parents, have you ever done anything for your kids without expecting something in return? At some point. Again, you're not expecting them to pay it off in year 1 or 2 of their life, but you're expecting them to pay it off 20 years down the road, 30 years, 40 years, 50 down. I am. I'll be honest. I don't want to raise selfish kids. I expect that when I changed my kids' diapers 20 years ago, they're going to change my diapers in another 30 or 40 years. I'm just being honest with you. We're going to send this one to the kids, by the way. It's just how we're wired, right? Or friendship. Like, would you keep hanging out with somebody who never, ever serves or loves or gives to you? It's just you only serve or love or give to them. I know I've had friends like that, And then I just have to like come to my senses. I'm like, why am I even friends with this person? They're so selfish. Or we would see this in our own kids when they were growing up, and we were like nudging them away from people like that, right? Because we don't want them to be in relationships with people who are just so selfish. But this is my point, is like, we're all selfish. Do you see that? Like nobody's wired to serve or give or love. Nobody's wired to do that without expecting something in return. We're all selfish. But what we're talking about in this series is that for followers of Jesus, we need to understand a different kind of ethic where God expects us to be the most generous people that anyone has ever met in all these different ways. And so I think it's going to be a challenge to all of us to say, is this true of us if we're followers of Jesus? Now, what I want to do for the rest of this introductory message is I want to just show you 3 examples of God's generosity in the Bible. Because this ethic isn't just floating out there on its own. This ethic comes from who God is. God is generous. We serve a generous God in so many different ways, and I've just got a few for you today. Number 1, God's generous provision. We see it in the very first chapter of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, verses 28 to 30, says this. He had just made Adam and Eve, and it says, then God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and govern it. Reign over the fish of the sea, the birds in the sky, and all the animals that scurry along the ground. And then God said, verse 29, look. Now pay attention to this. Maybe you've read this before. You've heard of this before, but I want you to pay attention to this in the context of generosity. Look at how generous God is. This is like one of the earliest things he does that's recorded for us. He says to the humans, to Adam and Eve, look, I've given you every seed-bearing plant throughout the earth and all the fruit trees for your food. Look, I've given all this to you. It's like me walking in with AJ to the Matchbox aisle and say, you can have all of it. I've given it all to you. My money or yours, see what it said. And in verse 30 he says, and I've given every green plant as food for all the wild animals. So he wasn't just generous to the humans, he was generous to the animals. The birds in the sky, the small animals that scurry along the ground, everything that has life, any creature that had life in its lungs, God was generous toward them. And it says, and this is what happened is God is just generous. I mean, think about what God did there. God created if you go back to the creation story, man and woman, humans were the last to be created. So what God did there, and this is good, by the way, for anyone, we got a lot of people getting married these days at Alpine. I love that. We got lots of young people at Alpine Church. Love is in the air. Lots of people are meeting each other, getting married. I just did a wedding yesterday. We've got another one later this month. And my own daughter and her fiance, Luke the Loser, they're going to be getting married. Got all kinds of stuff going on. It's great. But so this is good for everybody, for people who are yet to get married or maybe soon to get married or who are already married. Look at what this is such a great model for us. God created everything. He created this environment where life could flourish, and then he put people there. So he created this environment where life could flourish. Water and sun and trees and animals, everything. He created all this beauty on the earth because he's generous. He created all that. He took the time to create all this environment that could sustain life. And then he put humans there because he's generous. And he said, I did this all for you. Because I want you to thrive here. I want you to live here. I want you to have what you need. I'm a generous God. This is what God did. This, by the way, is what we should do. Young people, if you don't have kids, if you're a young, newlywed, you don't have kids yet, work hard to create an environment in your relationship, in your home, in your finances, in every way. Work hard to create an environment that can sustain life, an environment that's healthy so that when you do bring kids into the equation, that there's love and provision for them. That's being generous. That's being like God for your children someday. You're generous like God. You're creating God's image, and he's given you this kind of authority in your life. He's given you this mandate in your life to create something. May this be true of all of our families, is that we just create these environments where kids grow and feel loved and cared for and provided for, and then they can do the same thing for their kids and on down through the generations, this is God's heart for us. And God was the first one to do it, even though he did not expect anything in return. Think about it. He did all this knowing full well that Adam and Eve would disobey and reject his provision and grace and goodness and kindness and love. He knew all this and he still went through with it. It's crazy to me. It shows how generous he really is. And so then Adam and Eve, if you know the story, he's like, they're in the Garden of Eden, and God was like, all this stuff is yours. Just don't eat from that one tree in the middle of the Garden of Eden. That's the only one that's off limits. All the others are for you. Like how generous is God that he would say that? Everything else is for you. But Adam and Eve they were just like, we just got to know what that tastes like. That we just got to know why? And then of course Satan comes and says, why would God just doesn't, he's withholding something from you. He's not, basically Satan's message is God's not generous. He's mean. He's harsh. He's restricting you from this thing. Like there must be, like you should go eat that. And then you're really going to know. And so they instead of following this generous, kind, loving God, they listen to the enemy, the lies of the enemy. And they eat from the one tree that they could have just had a heyday on all the other trees. And yet they had to eat from that one tree. And sin entered the world. And yet God still is generous because that's just who he is. God is generous. Jesus said it like this, Matthew 5:45, for he gives his sunlight to both the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust alike. Like he's generous to all of us. Christians, non-Christians, everybody. He's generous to all of it. If you're a Republican, he's generous to Democrats. If you're a Democrat, he's generous to Republicans. He's generous to everybody. This is just who he is. He's a good God. He gives people an opportunity to experience his goodness, even though he knows that they can't give anything back. That's the definition of generosity. Or how about his generous guidance? James 1:5 says this, if you need wisdom, ask our generous God and he'll give it to you. He will not rebuke you for asking. This is great. Wives, you need to hear this verse because sometimes I feel like in marriage, we hear it a lot. Sometimes in marriage, it's like the husband's just like, I just don't understand what she's saying. I don't understand what she wants from me. This is a terrible thing for me to say right now. I don't even have this in my notes. I don't know where I'm going right now with this. I'm just talking myself out of this right now, this whole example. But maybe you have a relationship like this where husbands, you can't understand your wife, or wives, you can't understand your husband. Like you're like, I don't understand it. I just want to know you, but I can't know you. We're like so different. I don't understand this. And here's the reason I'm bringing this up is this is not God's heart toward us. God's heart is not to be elusive. God's heart is not to be hard to figure out. God's heart is like, if you want wisdom, just ask. I'm not hiding. I'm not withholding anything from you. Like I want you to know how to live. I want you to know what pleases me. I want you to know what makes me smile. This is God's heart toward us. In fact, Solomon is such a great example of this. King Solomon from the Old Testament, here's his prayer to God in 1 Kings 3. He says, give me an understanding heart so I can govern your people well and know the difference between right and wrong. For who by himself is able to govern this great people of yours? God basically came to Solomon and said, ask whatever you want. And Solomon's like, I don't want money. I don't want women. I don't want any. I just want wisdom. And God's response to him was this, verse 10. The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for wisdom. So he replied, because you've asked for wisdom in governing my people with justice and have not asked for a long life or wealth or the death of your enemies, I will give you what you asked for. I will give you a wise and understanding heart, such that no one else has had or ever will have. And I will also give you what you did not ask for, riches and fame. No other king in all the world will be compared to you for the rest of your life. Look at that, like God's provision to Solomon. You didn't ask for all this other stuff, so I'm going to not just give you wisdom, I'm going to give you all the other stuff. I'm going to just throw it in for you because I appreciate your heart. And Solomon's the guy who wrote many of the Proverbs, if you've ever read those. He's the guy who wrote Ecclesiastes, and you can see his wisdom on display in these books of the Bible. How refreshing would it be if every politician would be like Solomon? Now, Solomon wasn't perfect, but even just that heart to say, God, I want your wisdom. I want to know how to rule. I want to know right and wrong. I want to understand right and wrong. Because we've talked about this, like right and wrong comes from the fact that there is a God. And Solomon understood that. And so Solomon went to God and said, I want to know right and wrong, morality, ethics. We need to remember that in our country, by the way. And by the way, that's not just a political statement. Like, how awesome would it be if we as human beings would just come to God and say, God, I want you to tell me what's right and wrong in my life. In this particular situation, I want to know from you what you want me to do. I want your wisdom. And may we have that kind of heart toward God, a soft heart toward God that says, you tell me what's right. And the good thing about it is he's given us those answers right there in his word. He's given us the Bible, and so 95% of the answers are right there, so clearly spelled out in the Bible. And so I encourage you to open your word, because God is a generous God when it comes to guidance and wisdom. And then the last one's just super obvious, and we've got to finish with this one. And it's just God's generous love. And we see it in the most famous book in the Bible, or the most famous verse in the Bible, John 3:16. It says this, for this is how God loved the world. He gave his one and only Son, so that everyone who believes in him will not perish, but have eternal life. You want to know how God loved the world? He gave. Generosity. He gave. What did he give? His one and only Son. The love of God is most on display in the person of Jesus Christ, because Jesus went to the cross. He died on the cross in our place for us. And think about it, when God created Adam and Eve way back at the beginning, he knew this was going to happen. From the foundation of the earth, God knew what it would cost him to do this, and yet he still did this whole human experiment. He still did it because he's a generous God, and he knew what it would cost him. But he wanted to show us the person of Jesus is not about like who Jesus is and his death on the cross and all that stuff that we celebrate at Easter and really every Sunday at Alpine Church. That stuff is not about our worthiness. It's not a measure of our goodness. It's not even a measure of our value, to be honest with you. It's a measure of God's love. The death of Jesus on the cross and his resurrection is a measure of God's love for us. This is what Paul's getting at in Romans 5:8. God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. This is the love, this is the generosity of God on display in Jesus Christ. I couldn't imagine a way for me to quantify love. I couldn't imagine using anything other than my son or my daughter or my wife to express how much I would love somebody. And I think that's why we have this concept in the gospel, is that God gave his Son. Any mom or dad understands how that quantifies a person's love. Like you guys all seem like really kind, nice people, but I love my kids more than you guys. And you all should say that same thing about your kids. And that's how God felt, and yet God gave his Son. It's because he's generous. And because we're following this God, we should be generous too. As followers of Jesus, like the more we get to know God, and I don't know if you know a generous person. I encourage you maybe at lunch today or sometime maybe on the way home is talk about who's the most generous person you know. That's a great conversation to have. And I know some pretty generous people. And every person that I know who's generous, who would make that short list, every single one of those people is generous because God is generous and they're followers of a generous God. May the generosity of God inspire us to be more like him in our world. That's what we're going to be talking about in this series. Let's pray together. Father, thank you for who you are, and thank you for this generosity that is just on display. Every time we open your word, it's just on display. And Lord, I pray for the person in here who doesn't know that generosity. They've never really seen it. They've never experienced it. Maybe they don't have people in their life that model that. Maybe they don't really understand that side of you, God. Maybe they've only ever seen the side of God that is on display in some other churches where it's not loving and kind and gracious and self-sacrificing. Maybe they just have the wrong picture of God. But God, I pray today, starting today, that we would begin to get a better picture of a generous God, a God who does sacrifice, a God who gives, a God who is selfless, a God who doesn't even expect anything in return. Because the truth is, God, we don't have anything to give you. We don't have anything to offer to you. And yet still, you give us so much. Thank you, Father, for giving your Son. Thank you, Jesus, for giving your life and for going through with it to demonstrate the gracious generosity of God. And I pray that we would respond to it in Jesus' name. Amen.